The millionaire's mother accused the maid of stealing a valuable jewel, and the millionaire fired her. But what the maid said made his whole body tremble. In a quiet part of the bustling city, Maria lived a modest life, far removed from the opulence that awaited her each morning. Her day began well before the sun rose, her small, sparsely furnished room coming to life with her careful movements as she prepared for the long hours ahead. Maria was no stranger to hard work. In fact, it was woven into the very fabric of her existence. Having grown up in a family that scraped by with whatever they could find, she knew the value of every penny she earned. But Maria was more than just a maid. She was a daughter and a sister, the lifeline for her family, who relied heavily on her steady income. Her father had passed away years ago, and her mother, once strong and full of life, now fell ill frequently, leaving Maria with the responsibility of keeping their humble home afloat. Her younger brother, barely out of his teens, was still studying, and Maria was determined to support his education, hoping he'd have opportunities she'd never had. Her dedication showed in everything she did. Maria's employers at the mansion always found their home immaculate, as she took pride in every corner, every dusted shelf, and every polished silver tray. She knew her place and carried herself with humility, never overstepping her boundaries or showing signs of fatigue, no matter how long the day stretched. Maria was the kind of person whose quiet presence brought an order that the wealthy family took for granted. But the life of service came with its share of struggles. She bore the occasional scoldings, the unkind remarks, and even the insinuations from people who barely knew her. She absorbed each comment with quiet grace, finding solace in the thought that she was doing this for her family. Her dreams and desires were simple: a stable life for those she loved, respect for her hard work, and enough hope to keep her going. Every morning, she took the long bus ride to the mansion, her thoughts filled with her family and the weight of her responsibilities. Yet, despite the hardships, Maria never allowed herself to sink into despair. Her spirit, though tested, remained resilient. It was her humble heart and steady resolve that had helped her endure, keeping her loyal and steadfast even when life seemed impossibly unfair. And though she was but a maid in the eyes of the world, to those who knew her best, Maria was far more. She was their strength, their hope, and their unspoken hero. But soon Maria would face a test unlike any she'd ever known, one that would shake her world and question everything she had so carefully built. The mansion stood like a beacon of wealth and status, an imposing structure with marble columns, sprawling gardens, and intricately crafted fountains. The grandeur of the estate was undeniable, a fortress of opulence surrounded by towering iron gates. Every aspect of the house, every fine detail, from the lush velvet drapes in the drawing rooms to the chandeliers that hung like glass masterpieces in every hall, told a story of privilege, old money, and a family accustomed to luxury. This was the home of Edward Montgomery, a reclusive millionaire, and his mother, Margaret. Edward had inherited his wealth from generations of industrious ancestors, each adding to the family fortune with businesses, investments, and a knack for maintaining power. Despite his affluence, Edward was a quiet figure who rarely made public appearances, much preferring the sanctuary of his home and the people closest to him. He was polite to the staff and generous enough, but his kindness was distant, like a man who carried both the weight of wealth and the quiet, unspoken burdens it brought. But if Edward was the reserved master of the house, Margaret Montgomery was its formidable matriarch. Dignified, elegant, and proud, she was a woman who demanded respect, not through affection, but by the sheer force of her presence. She walked through the mansion with the confidence of someone who owned every corner of it, and everyone in it. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, especially when it came to matters of propriety and order. She took her role as the head of the household seriously, ensuring that every member of the staff understood their place. For Maria, the mansion was more than a place of work. It was an entirely different world, one that clashed with her own modest existence. As she walked through the gleaming halls each day, she was reminded of her status as someone who blended into the background. The house was a stage, with her as an invisible presence, cleaning, arranging, and making herself scarce before the owners even noticed her. Despite her hard work, Maria always knew she was just the maid, a position with clear, unyielding boundaries. And Margaret was quick to reinforce those boundaries. To her, Maria was just one of many who had come and gone over the years, an interchangeable part of the household machinery. While Edward may have acknowledged her presence with an occasional nod, his mother's gaze held a certain wariness, even disapproval, that seemed to keep Maria forever at arm's length. It was this world of wealth, control, and untouchable power that would soon collide with Maria's life in a way neither she nor the family could ever anticipate. Within the mansion's grand walls, there existed an unspoken hierarchy, a delicate balance of power and roles that each member of the household adhered to without question. At the very top was Margaret Montgomery, whose word was practically law. She was both feared and respected by the staff, who understood that one misstep could mean a swift dismissal. To Margaret, each worker had a place, and she believed it was her duty to ensure they never forgot it. With a raised eyebrow or a slight frown, she could convey 1,000 commands. Her authority was as much a part of the house as its walls, shaping the atmosphere and dictating the behavior of everyone beneath her. Maria, like the other staff, felt the weight of Margaret's scrutiny daily. No matter how hard she worked, she could feel Margaret's judgmental gaze, searching for any flaw, any sign that might betray a lack of dedication or decorum. To Margaret, Maria was competent but unworthy of trust, an attitude she extended to all the servants. Maria accepted this as a part of the job, another invisible burden she carried. But her patience and humility only seemed to reinforce Margaret's opinion that Maria, like any other maid, was a simple fixture of the house, replaceable and ordinary. Edward, on the other hand, was a different story. As the master of the house, he carried himself with a calm, almost aloof grace, preferring to keep a distance from the staff rather than wielding power over them. He was kind in a reserved way, often nodding politely when he saw Maria working in the hallways or giving a quiet thank you if he crossed paths with her during her duties. Yet his actions were always tempered by his mother's influence, as though he operated within an invisible boundary she had set for him, one he dared not cross. There were rare moments when Maria felt she saw a hint of sympathy in his gaze, but those moments never lingered. Edward would retreat into his quiet world, leaving Maria to resume her work with a faint reminder of kindness lingering, quickly overshadowed by the rigidity of her position in the household. The invisible rules governed every interaction, every glance, and every word exchanged within the mansion. For Maria, it was a lesson in humility and silence, a reminder of her place in a world that was not her own. She understood the power dynamics well and kept her head down, trusting that her hard work would keep her in the family's good graces. But this delicate balance was about to be disrupted. Soon, Maria would find herself at the center of a storm, one that would expose the true nature of power and loyalty within the walls of the Montgomery mansion. It began on an ordinary morning, one that Maria started like any other, cleaning, organizing, ensuring that everything was in its proper place. But as the sun rose higher, illuminating the mansion's marble floors with a gentle glow, a commotion rippled through the halls. Margaret's prized sapphire pendant, a jewel as brilliant as it was valuable, had gone missing. The pendant was Margaret's pride, an heirloom passed down from her own mother, known not only for its monetary worth but for its sentimental value. She wore it sparingly, saving it for grand events, often recounting its story to guests who admired it. So, when she reached for the small velvet box only to find it empty, her shock quickly shifted to anger. Her voice rang out in a sharp call, and within minutes, every member of the household was summoned to the parlor, their faces tense with confusion and apprehension. Whispers floated through the mansion, each worker casting anxious glances at the others, all wondering who might have dared to take something so precious. Margaret's distress was palpable as she looked over the gathered staff, her fingers tapping impatiently on the arm of her chair. "It must be found," she declared, her voice cold and unyielding. "That pendant means more to me than any of you might understand. And I will not rest until it is returned." The tension in the room grew thick, each servant suddenly aware of the gravity of the situation. This was no small loss, and Margaret's anger hinted that swift and severe punishment would follow any sign of guilt. Edward stood nearby, watching with a detached expression, perhaps embarrassed by the scene or weary of his mother's dramatics, but he remained silent. As Margaret scanned the faces of each servant, her eyes rested on Maria. It was only for a moment, but the intensity of her gaze felt like a lead weight, heavy and accusatory. Maria's pulse quickened as she held her gaze down, feeling the pressure of unspoken suspicion looming over her. Margaret's expression was inscrutable, but there was something sharp and unsettling in her gaze. "Whoever is responsible," Margaret said, her voice laced with bitterness, "will regret this foolishness. I assure you." The accusation had not yet been spoken aloud, but the air was thick with apprehension. Maria could feel the heat of suspicion spreading among the staff, as if an invisible hand had already cast blame upon her. She stood silently, fearing what might come next, dreading the sense of inevitability that hung over the room. As Margaret's gaze settled heavily upon Maria, the whispering among the other servants quieted, leaving only an uncomfortable silence that seemed to echo off the opulent walls. Maria felt the weight of every eye in the room on her, each glance carrying a silent accusation. She swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together, determined to remain steady, even as fear crept into her heart. Margaret didn't hesitate to let her suspicions turn into open accusation. "Maria," she said, her voice slicing through the silence like a blade, "you were the last person in my room before I discovered the jewel missing. Is there anything you'd like to tell us?" Maria's cheeks flushed as she shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know anything about the pendant, ma'am. I only cleaned the room, just like every other day." But Margaret was unconvinced. Her expression grew sharper, her lips thinning as she looked down at Maria with an almost icy contempt. "It's awfully convenient, isn't it? You, a girl from a background where something like that sapphire would be more than tempting, alone in my room." She let the words linger, dripping with a suspicion that seemed to cement itself in the minds of everyone present. "I would never steal from you, Mrs. Montgomery," Maria replied, her voice shaking but resolute. Yet she felt her words falter under the pressure of Margaret's piercing stare, the unspoken command to confess hanging heavy in the air. The other staff members remained silent, shifting uncomfortably, each relieved to escape the brunt of Margaret's anger. Some looked at Maria with pity, others with distrust, as though her innocence or guilt had already been decided in Margaret's mind. For Maria, the humiliation of standing there, exposed to judgment and contempt, felt unbearable. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "It would be easier on you to confess now, rather than wait until we involve the authorities. You could be out on the streets by tonight, without a penny to your name. I'm sure you understand the seriousness of what I'm saying." Maria's heart raced as she realized the precariousness of her situation. There was no evidence, no witnesses to her innocence, only Margaret's suspicion that held enough weight to crush her completely. The shame of her position pressed down on her, making it difficult to breathe. Tears pricked her eyes, but she forced them back, unwilling to let her fear and humiliation show. She felt trapped, cornered by a powerful woman who had already decided her guilt. Her silence, though born of fear, only seemed to confirm the unspoken belief that hung in the air. The maid was guilty. Edward had observed the entire scene, his gaze shifting between his mother and Maria, caught between the tension of accusation and the instinctive pull of his own conscience. He knew Maria to be diligent and quiet, a woman who had never given him reason to doubt her integrity. But his mother's anger was unwavering, her conviction in Maria's guilt unyielding, as though she had already passed judgment without needing proof. Margaret turned to her son, her expression a mix of expectation and impatience. "Edward," she said pointedly, "surely you see there's no choice in the matter. We cannot have a thief under our roof. This is unacceptable." For a moment, Edward felt a flicker of resistance. He looked at Maria, whose face was pale, her eyes pleading silently for someone to believe her. A quiet voice in his mind urged him to listen to his instincts, to question the accusation that felt thin and rash. Yet his mother's gaze held a familiar authority, a force that he had learned to obey from a young age. To challenge her now would be an affront, a disruption of the harmony she fiercely maintained in their lives. Edward cleared his throat. His voice measured yet uncertain. "Mother, I'm not sure we should act so quickly. There's no evidence. Perhaps it's been misplaced." But Margaret's eyes flared with indignation. "Misplaced," she echoed, her voice sharp and disbelieving. "That pendant has never been misplaced, Edward. This girl was alone in my room. Who else could it be?" Maria's lip quivered as she looked from Margaret to Edward, hoping he might see her desperation, her innocence. But his hesitation was brief, his shoulders slumping slightly as he caved under the weight of his mother's certainty. "Maria," he began, his voice softer, almost regretful. "I think it's best if you leave. At least until we resolve this matter." The words struck her like a physical blow, each one chipping away at the life she had worked so hard to build. Fired just like that, without a shred of evidence or the chance to defend herself. Her throat tightened as she felt the hot sting of tears, but she swallowed them back, refusing to give Margaret the satisfaction of seeing her break. She managed a shaky nod, her hands trembling as she turned to leave. The other staff members averted their eyes, their silence a further condemnation that deepened her shame. With a final glance at Edward, she saw only the shadow of regret, a faint sign that he, too, had fallen victim to his mother's formidable will. As she walked out of the mansion's grand doors, Maria's heart was heavy with sorrow and bitterness, but in its depths stirred a quiet, unyielding resolve. She would not leave her honor in shambles without a fight. With her belongings hastily packed and her pride wounded, Maria stood outside the gates of the mansion, staring at the towering estate with a mixture of disbelief and pain. She felt the weight of the unjust accusation bearing down on her, her heart aching not only for the loss of her job but also for the betrayal of trust she'd never had the chance to earn. But as she thought of her family and the life she'd tried so hard to sustain, Maria realized that she couldn't simply walk away, defeated and dishonored. Taking a deep breath, Maria straightened her shoulders and marched back toward the gate, her steps slow but resolute. She couldn't leave without one final attempt to clear her name, without one last plea to Edward's conscience. She had sensed a softness in him, a hint of doubt that he might have been willing to listen if not for his mother's dominance. She clung to that faint glimmer of hope as she approached the front door and knocked. A servant answered, his face registering mild surprise but quickly turning to impassive formality as he ushered her inside. Maria waited in the dim, stately hallway, the silence amplifying the pounding of her heart. She knew this could be her only chance to tell her truth, to explain herself, perhaps even to reveal a piece of her past she had never intended to share. After a few tense moments, Edward appeared, his face betraying a hint of discomfort as he looked at her. The weight of his decision, she could see, had not sat easily on his conscience. "Maria," he greeted, his voice low but steady. "I thought you'd already left." "Please, sir," Maria began, her voice trembling but determined. "I came back because I have to speak with you. I need you to know that I'm innocent. I did not take Mrs. Montgomery's pendant, and I would never betray your trust or steal from you." Edward shifted uneasily, avoiding her gaze, as if the words he was about to say would bring him further guilt. "Maria, my mother is certain." Maria raised a hand, interrupting him gently. "There's something you don't know, something that might change how you see me and this whole situation." Her eyes shone with a fierce desperation, a resolve that went beyond her fear of losing her job. "I've kept my past private because I wanted to work here without anyone's pity. But I need you to know that I once had a connection to this family. A connection that would make stealing from you unthinkable." Edward's brow furrowed, a look of confusion and dawning curiosity flickering across his face. He gestured for her to continue, her words holding him in tense, cautious anticipation. Maria took a deep breath, her heart hammering as she prepared to reveal the truth she had long kept hidden. She looked directly at Edward, gathering the courage to share a part of herself she had never intended to bring into the light. "Years ago," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "my mother worked in this household. She was employed here before you were even born, and she was close to your father. Too close, some would say." Edward's expression shifted from mild curiosity to outright shock. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Maria pressed on, hoping he would understand the weight of what she was sharing. My mother never talked much about her past, she continued, but I knew that she had once loved someone beyond her reach, someone from a world entirely different from ours. I never knew the details, but she left this house heartbroken and never returned. She wanted nothing from him, not even when she realized she was carrying his child. That child is me. The color drained from Edward's face as he absorbed her words, his body going tense. His eyes searched hers, seeking any sign that she might be lying, but Maria's expression held nothing but sincerity and a quiet sorrow that betrayed years of hidden pain. He struggled to process this revelation, his mind reeling as pieces of an unseen puzzle began to fall into place. "You're saying," he stammered, "you're saying my father. He was also your father?" Maria nodded, her gaze steady but filled with a vulnerability she could no longer hide. "Yes. And I wanted nothing more than to work here in peace, to honor my mother's memory and carry on with dignity. I never expected to be welcomed, but I never dreamed I would be accused of something as terrible as theft. I came back because I couldn't leave knowing that you thought I would do something like this." Edward felt a chill settle over him, his mind racing as he grappled with this new reality. It was as if a door had opened to a hidden past, a truth that had lain buried for years, untouched and unspoken. His body trembled slightly, a reaction he hadn't anticipated as he tried to reconcile the fact that this woman, this humble, quiet maid he had barely noticed, was his own sister. In that moment, the weight of his mother's accusation, his own dismissal of Maria, and the terrible injustice of it all bore down on him with crushing force. The guilt tightened around him, suffocating as he realized he had cast aside his own blood, accusing her of a crime without a shred of proof. "Maria, he began, but his voice faltered, the enormity of his actions hanging between them, raw and undeniable. Edward staggered back a step, the revelation ringing in his ears, each word repeating like an echo he couldn't shake. The bond of family, something he had thought confined to his mother and himself, had suddenly broadened to include Maria, a woman he had dismissed without a thought. The implications overwhelmed him, forcing him to confront the depth of his own ignorance, and the ease with which he had allowed his mother to dictate his perceptions. For years, he had relied on his mother's judgment, deferring to her authority, trusting her wisdom without question. She had raised him to believe in the integrity of their family legacy, a story of strength, loyalty, and a certain unbreakable pride. But now, that pride felt more like blindness, and he saw his mother's actions in a stark, unsettling light. His mind spun as he thought of his mother's cold treatment of Maria, the certainty with which she had labeled her a thief. Could it be that Margaret had known of this connection all along? Perhaps she had kept it a secret, determined to preserve her image of an untarnished family. Or worse, had she sensed something and in her suspicion, decided to drive Maria out, unwilling to risk her influence in the household. The thought gnawed at him, his mother's authoritative figure twisting in his mind from protector to something darker, something calculated. He knew she could be manipulative, sometimes unyielding to the point of cruelty, but he had never questioned the lengths to which she might go to control his life, and the lives of those around him. He thought of Maria's quiet presence in the mansion, how she had served tirelessly, facing his mother's scrutiny day after day without ever revealing the painful truth of her own heritage. She had remained steadfast, loyal even, while he had stood by and done nothing. Now, the weight of his complicity struck him with a force that left him reeling. "Maria," he murmured, struggling to find the words that would bridge the chasm he had helped create. I didn't know. I can't believe. I've treated you so unjustly. If I had known, if I had understood." Maria watched him, her expression a mixture of pain and understanding. She saw the battle unfolding within him, the dawning realization of his own mistakes. But she held her silence, letting him confront the truth of his actions on his own. Edward's heart raced as he felt the threads of loyalty and duty begin to unravel. His loyalty to his mother now entangled with his sense of justice and kinship toward Maria. He knew he couldn't leave this revelation unaddressed. This was a moment of reckoning, one that demanded he confront not just his mother but the very foundations of his life, his beliefs and his future. Edward's mind was still reeling as he walked through the grand corridors, his steps heavy with a newfound purpose. The revelation of Maria's true identity had shaken him, but as he approached his mother's study, his determination grew. He could no longer ignore the unsettling suspicions creeping into his thoughts. If his mother had harbored any knowledge of Maria's background, her accusations were not only unjust, they were deliberate. He paused outside her door, steeling himself. He knew this confrontation would be unlike any other he'd had with her. Their conversations had always followed a predictable rhythm. She led, he followed. But today, he was no longer willing to play his part. Taking a steadying breath, he knocked once and then entered without waiting for permission. Margaret looked up from her writing desk, surprise flickering across her face as she took in his expression. "Edward," she said, setting down her pen, "you look rather intense. Is something the matter?" He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Mother," he began, his voice low but unyielding, "I need to know the truth about Maria. Did you know who she was? Did you know she was connected to our family?" For a moment, Margaret's face remained calm, her gaze steady as if considering how much to reveal. But Edward saw a faint shadow of something else in her eyes, an evasion perhaps, or even a trace of guilt. She folded her hands neatly, her posture controlled and composed. "Edward," she replied slowly, "I don't know what you're insinuating. That girl is a maid. Nothing more, nothing less." He clenched his fists, pushing down the frustration that threatened to overtake him. "She's more than that, and you know it. She's my sister, our family. And you've known this, haven't you? You knew who she was, yet you accused her of theft, ready to throw her out without a second thought." Margaret's gaze turned steely, her calm demeanor giving way to something colder, sharper. "And what if I did know?" she replied, her tone smooth but laced with an edge. "What difference would it make? That woman is no more family to you than any stranger off the street. I've done what was necessary to protect you, to protect our name." Edward's chest tightened, his disbelief giving way to anger. "Protect me. Or protect yourself." His voice rose, each word layered with the resentment he'd kept buried for years. "All these years you've kept me in the dark, using family honor as an excuse for your own control. This isn't protection, Mother. It's manipulation." Margaret's expression darkened, her eyes flashing with indignation. "Mind your tone, Edward. Everything I have done has been for you, for this family. Sometimes sacrifices must be made." Edward felt the final strands of loyalty unravel as he saw the truth behind her mask. This confrontation had laid bare the depth of her deception, and he could no longer turn a blind eye. Margaret's face hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line as she watched her son, clearly disapproving of his defiance. Yet Edward saw a flicker of something else, hesitation, perhaps even a glimmer of vulnerability. He pressed on, unwilling to back down now that he was so close to uncovering the full truth. "Mother," he said firmly, "why were you so quick to accuse Maria? It was as if you were waiting for any reason to rid the house of her. Tell me, did you stage this theft to drive her away?" Margaret's expression shifted, the carefully composed mask slipping just enough to reveal a hint of discomfort. But she quickly straightened, lifting her chin defiantly. "Edward," she replied coldly, "I did what was necessary. That girl had no place in this household. She was a risk, a liability. You don't understand the complexities of our world, the pressures of maintaining our name, our legacy." Edward felt a surge of indignation rise within him. "A risk," he echoed, his voice filled with disbelief. "She's family, Mother. She's my sister. You kept this from me, hid the truth, and now you're trying to destroy her reputation. This isn't about protecting our name. It's about protecting your own pride and control over this house." Margaret's face twisted, her usual poise crumbling under the weight of his accusations. For a brief moment, she looked almost human, stripped of her usual armor of indifference and authority. Her voice, when she spoke, was tight with an uncharacteristic vulnerability. "You think you understand everything, Edward, but you don't. I have sacrificed far more than you realize. When I suspected her connection to your father, I knew I couldn't allow it. This family, your father's legacy, wasn't built to include illegitimacies." The admission hung in the air, heavy with the weight of years of deception. Edward's stomach churned as he realized the full extent of his mother's motives. She had known or at least suspected Maria's true identity from the start, yet instead of addressing it with compassion, she had chosen to suppress it, to erase any hint of a stain on their family's polished image. "So you staged this theft to justify firing her," Edward said, his tone hollow. "You planted the idea that she'd stolen from you, knowing that with no means to defend herself, she would be forced to leave. You wanted to cast her out, not because she's guilty, but because she exists." Margaret's silence was her only answer, and Edward felt a wave of revulsion wash over him. The mother he'd once revered was now revealed as a woman willing to destroy lives in the name of family pride, a pride that had become nothing more than a cage. In that moment, he knew the truth. His loyalty to her could not be reconciled with his conscience. Edward stood there, rooted to the spot, as if the ground beneath him had vanished, leaving him in freefall. The walls of his life, the principles his mother had instilled, the legacy he'd been taught to protect, the blind respect he'd given her, all of it now felt like a web of lies, spun to keep him compliant and isolated from the truth. He looked at his mother, the woman who had been his guiding force, his foundation, and felt an unfamiliar surge of anger and disappointment that left him breathless. "Mother," he said, his voice quiet but steely, "I don't even know who you are anymore." Margaret's eyes flashed with something akin to fury, though a trace of vulnerability remained in her gaze. "Edward," she said sharply, "don't be naive. The world isn't as simple as you seem to believe. This family's reputation didn't build itself. It's taken generations of sacrifice, careful planning, and yes, sometimes difficult choices. We cannot afford to be seen as anything less than perfect. Do you think your father would have approved of this girl entering our lives?" "Father," Edward's voice wavered as he looked away, thinking of the father he'd known, a man who had been stern yet fair, strong yet warm in his own way. He'd always believed his father would have wanted him to stand for something greater than appearances. But his father's legacy had been redefined in the worst way, used as a tool to manipulate, conceal, and deceive. "Maybe he wouldn't have approved," Edward replied, a hint of bitterness in his voice, "but that doesn't make this right. You went beyond protection, Mother. You lied, you deceived, and you tried to ruin an innocent woman's life because of your pride." Margaret's face hardened further, all traces of softness vanishing as she grasped for control over the unraveling situation. "If you continue down this path, Edward, you'll only bring chaos upon this family. Do you want to be responsible for that? Think of the consequences. Think of what this could mean for us." "I have thought about it," Edward replied, his voice growing firmer with each word. "And I can't live like this. I won't betray what's right just to preserve an illusion. Family is more than reputation. It's supposed to mean loyalty and truth." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a painful resolve. "And I'm going to make this right, with or without your approval." For the first time in his life, Edward saw his mother for who she truly was, someone who would sacrifice anything, including her own humanity, to uphold the facade she had crafted. This realization tore through him, searing away the last remnants of his blind obedience. Their relationship would never be the same. He would no longer live under the weight of her expectations or be bound by the fear of tarnishing the family name. The path forward was uncertain, but Edward knew one thing. He had to act, to stand for the sister he had wronged and to finally become his own man. The weight of his decision followed Edward as he made his way through the winding halls, each step bringing him closer to Maria. She had been unjustly cast out of his life, and in his complicity, he had nearly allowed her to be erased from their family history. He could not undo the harm his mother had caused or take back his own actions, but he could begin to make amends. He found Maria where he least expected, outside the servant quarters, collecting her few remaining belongings in silence, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked up when she heard his footsteps approaching, her face guarded. Edward saw the pain etched in her expression, a quiet heartbreak that spoke of betrayal, disappointment, and the resolve of someone who had faced unfairness too many times. "Maria," he said softly, the words nearly catching in his throat. He felt an odd nervousness, a vulnerability he had rarely felt in his life. "Please, let me speak with you." She straightened, her face impassive, but her eyes betrayed her wounded pride. Edward took a deep breath, searching for the words to express the depth of his regret, though he feared no apology would ever suffice. "I can't begin to tell you how sorry I am," he began, his voice low and steady. "I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. I should have listened to you. I should have questioned everything, but I failed you." Maria's eyes softened slightly, though her expression remained cautious. "And why would you believe me now?" she asked, her voice tinged with hurt. "You chose to believe your mother without a second thought. What's changed?" Edward winced, recognizing the truth of her words. "I know I've lost your trust, and I don't blame you. But I've come to realize everything I thought was right, everything I've stood for in this family, has been built on false pride. My mother taught me to uphold our name at any cost, but she also taught me to ignore my own conscience." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "I don't want to live that way anymore. I'm here now not just because I feel guilt, but because I want you to know that you are family. My sister. I didn't know before, and if I had, things would have been different." The tension between them lingered, Maria's face betraying a mixture of shock and emotion she tried to contain. Edward continued, his tone raw with sincerity. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to make things right however I can. Please, let me try." Maria looked away, her face softening as the impact of his words settled over her. The bitterness in her heart had begun to melt, though she held her silence, her mind struggling to reconcile his apology with the pain of her recent humiliation. Maria took a steadying breath, her fingers nervously twisting together as she struggled to process Edward's words. Part of her wanted to forgive him, to believe that he was truly remorseful, that he had the courage to break away from his mother's influence. But another part of her, scarred from years of enduring the judgment and control of the powerful family, hesitated. "Edward," she began quietly, her voice carrying both the strength of her convictions and the vulnerability of her wounded heart. "I appreciate that you've come to me, that you want to make things right. But do you understand what it's like to live on the other side of this household? To be seen as nothing more than a servant, someone who can be dismissed, discarded, and accused without a moment's thought." He flinched, hearing the raw hurt in her voice, and nodded slowly. "I can't pretend to know what you've gone through, Maria. But I can promise that I will never again let someone in this house be treated as less than they are, especially not you." Maria took a deep breath, weighing his words. A part of her wanted to hold on to her anger, to let it shield her from the trust he now asked for. But she could see the honesty in his gaze, the deep regret that softened his features. She saw a man who was trying, perhaps for the first time, to see the world from her perspective, breaking free from the constraints of his upbringing. "I don't know if it's enough to simply apologize," she replied, though her voice had softened. "Words are one thing, but this isn't about a single incident. It's about a way of life, a way of treating people that's rooted in your family's very foundation." Edward's shoulders sagged slightly as he nodded, acknowledging the enormity of what she was saying. "I know," he said earnestly, "and I want to change that, not just for you but for everyone who works in this house. I want this family to stand for more than appearances. I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, but I hope that in time, you might see that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make amends." Maria looked away, blinking back the tears that threatened to surface. She had grown accustomed to mistrust, to the idea that promises were fleeting and apologies rarely genuine. Yet here was Edward, a man of privilege, laying bare his mistakes and offering his vulnerability, his willingness to grow. With a sigh, she looked back at him, a tentative smile breaking through her serious expression. "Then prove it," she said softly. "Show me that things can be different, that you truly want to change. That would mean more than any apology." Her words, though simple, held a powerful challenge, one that Edward accepted with a solemn nod. He knew the path to earning her forgiveness would be long, but he was ready to take the first step. A quiet understanding settled between Edward and Maria as they stood in the stillness of the hallway, each feeling the weight of their shared history and the possibilities of a changed future. Edward sensed, perhaps for the first time, the true strength and resilience that Maria embodied. A resilience she had built not from wealth or power, but from humility, patience, and a fierce loyalty to her own principles. He realized now how much he had overlooked, how easily he had dismissed her as just the maid, and how deeply he had wronged her by not seeing her for who she truly was. Maria, in turn, felt a shift within herself. Though part of her had been hardened by years of quiet endurance, Edward's genuine remorse and willingness to stand against his mother gave her a glimmer of hope, a hint that perhaps people could change, that perhaps he truly wanted to make amends, not just for her, but for everyone who had lived in the shadow of his family's rules. "Maria," he said gently, breaking the silence, "I want you to know that your life won't be controlled by my family's whims any longer. I'm committed to giving you the respect, the freedom, and the choice that you deserve. Whatever path you want to take from here, I'll support you." Maria's guarded expression softened. Her heart warmed by his words. "Thank you, Edward," she replied, her voice steady and resolute. "I've spent so much of my life thinking that respect was something I'd never receive, something reserved for those who live in houses like this one. But now, perhaps, I can begin to believe in something better." A faint smile touched Edward's lips as he took in her quiet dignity, her unwavering strength. He nodded. "If you'll let me, I'd like to start by helping you. If you choose to stay, you'll have a place here, but on terms that respect your worth. Or if you want to leave and pursue something else, I'll ensure you have the resources to do so." Maria thought about his words, her gaze distant. She realized this decision was about more than just forgiveness. It was about reclaiming her sense of self, about charting a future in which she could finally be free from the shadows of her past. "I think," she replied, choosing her words carefully, "that I need time to decide. But whatever I choose, I want you to know, I see that you're trying, that you're willing to change. That alone means more than you know." They stood there, two people once divided by status and circumstance, now bound by an unspoken promise. Their shared journey had brought them to a new understanding, one that transcended wealth, power, and privilege. A bond based on respect, resilience, and the hope for something more. A few days later, Edward approached Maria again, this time with a formal offer. After much thought, he had decided that his promise to her deserved tangible action, a gesture that would go beyond words and apologies. He had arranged for a modest but comfortable house in town, a place Maria could call her own. In addition, he offered her a role at the mansion that was unlike any she'd held before, one with authority, one that recognized her experience and commitment. Maria stood silently as he explained, her face reflecting a mixture of surprise and consideration. It was a generous offer, and the house was something she could scarcely have imagined owning in her previous life. Yet, as Edward spoke, she realized that his gesture was more than just charity. It was an acknowledgement of her worth, an opportunity for her to step into a new chapter of her life with independence and respect. "Maria," he finished, "I want this to be a choice for you. No one will dictate your life anymore. If you want to leave, I understand, and if you choose to stay, I promise things will be different. Either way, you'll have a home of your own, a place where you're in control." She looked at him, her expression thoughtful. This offer represented everything she had longed for: freedom, respect, stability for herself and her family. Her mind drifted to her mother's sacrifices, to the dreams she had put aside, and to the strength she had drawn on to survive in a world that had rarely shown her kindness. "I've given it a lot of thought," Maria replied at last, her voice steady. "And I think I'd like to accept the house. It's time I had something of my own, a place where I can start fresh." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "As for the role here, I'll accept it too, but only if I can make it into something meaningful. I want to help create a household where respect goes both ways, where people aren't treated as disposable." Edward smiled, a look of genuine relief and admiration in his eyes. "You have my word. I think, with your help, this household can finally become what it should have been all along." A quiet understanding passed between them, a feeling of mutual respect that felt both foreign and reassuring. This was no longer a relationship of employer and servant but of equals, bound by shared principles and the promise of a better future. For Maria, the mansion was no longer a place of confinement but a stage on which she could forge her own path, one built on integrity, self-respect, and strength. As they left the room, a sense of renewal filled the air, the dawn of a new beginning not only for Maria, but for the household and everyone within it. As Edward watched Maria accept her new role, he felt a profound sense of purpose, one that had been absent from his life until now. The days that followed were filled with small but deliberate changes within the mansion, each one reflecting his commitment to transform the household into a place where respect was not just a formality but a practice. He began by meeting with each member of the staff personally, encouraging open conversation and listening to their experiences. He wanted to understand their lives, their needs, and the ways he could create a more just environment for them. At first, some of the staff were hesitant, uncertain of this sudden shift in Edward's demeanor. But Maria, now a respected overseer within the household, worked alongside him, fostering trust and easing their fears. She reassured them, emphasizing that this change was not temporary, that it was a new beginning grounded in Edward's commitment to accountability and fairness. Edward also turned inward, reflecting on his own actions, his past, and the patterns he had allowed to dictate his life. He realized how easily he had let his mother's values shape him, how he had become passive in the face of her authority, and how he had, in many ways, inherited her judgmental outlook. With Maria's story as a mirror, he saw his own weaknesses and the missed opportunities for kindness, understanding, and compassion. Determined to be better, Edward began challenging himself in ways he hadn't before. He read books on leadership, fairness, and the importance of creating inclusive environments. He spoke openly with Maria, inviting her to guide him as he took on this new responsibility. Though the journey was humbling, each day he felt himself becoming stronger, freer, and more aligned with the person he wanted to be. A man who could lead with both integrity and humanity. Maria, in her own way, found herself softening toward Edward. She had come to realize that his transformation was sincere, that he was willing to confront his own flaws to make lasting changes. She saw how he took her suggestions to heart, how he treated each worker with respect, and how he gradually became a pillar of support rather than an aloof figurehead. Over time, her initial caution gave way to respect, and then to something deeper, a sense of camaraderie and shared purpose. She began to believe that perhaps, through Edward's efforts, the household could become a place where dignity and respect were foundational values, not privileges reserved for the wealthy. As they worked together, Edward and Maria not only changed the mansion, they changed each other, each offering strength and insight the other lacked. Their commitment to change was no longer just a personal journey. It had become a mission, one that they hoped would inspire those around them and create a legacy of compassion and respect that would endure for generations. With each passing day, the mansion transformed, not only in spirit but in the way people moved within its walls. There was a newfound ease among the staff, a quiet joy that replaced the old tension. They no longer lowered their eyes in fear of Margaret's sharp gaze or felt bound by the rigid, invisible rules that had once governed every step. Instead, they shared warm glances with one another, spoke openly about their concerns, and even began to feel a sense of pride in their work. For the first time, the house felt like a place where they could belong. Maria, too, found herself feeling something she hadn't expected, a sense of home. She walked through the mansion with a new confidence, her footsteps unhurried as she interacted with the staff and even some of the family's visitors, who were curious about this woman Edward had entrusted with such responsibility. Her presence was no longer shadowed by suspicion or fear, and she held herself with the quiet strength of someone who had finally claimed her worth. Edward often watched her, feeling a deep satisfaction as he saw the positive changes unfolding. He knew that Maria's acceptance of her role, her forgiveness, and her guidance had been instrumental in creating this atmosphere. Her resilience, patience, and commitment had laid the foundation for this new beginning. It was a reminder of the power of integrity and compassion, a lesson he would carry with him long after the memories of his former life faded away. Even his mother, Margaret, began to change, albeit slowly. At first, she resisted the transformations, watching with silent disapproval as Edward dismantled the rigid structure she had carefully built. But over time, she could not ignore the happiness radiating from the staff or the admiration guests expressed for Edward's new approach to running the household. She began to realize that the control she had once held so tightly might have been the very thing that isolated her. And while she still carried her pride, she softened, her interactions with Maria becoming less curt, her gaze less scrutinizing. One evening, Edward and Maria stood in the garden, watching as the last of the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the mansion's walls. The scene was peaceful, almost symbolic of the transformation that had taken root within those walls. "This place feels different," Maria remarked, a gentle smile lighting up her face. Edward nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "It is different. And it's because of you, Maria. Because you were brave enough to stand up, even when no one believed in you. You gave this place a heart." Maria's smile deepened, and she felt a warmth she hadn't known was possible. For the first time, she felt as if she truly belonged, not just in the mansion but in her life. They stood side by side, bound by a new, unbreakable connection, as the stars began to sprinkle the sky, their light a quiet promise of hope and the possibility of redemption.